5 minutes, or what would you prefer?
5 minutes is okay with me.
Okay.
Ryan, is that cool with you? Okay. Yeah,
it just depends on the attendance that you're anticipating. I mean, if you feel like the majority of the group is here after 5 minutes, then that's fine with me.
Okay, yeah, we can wait until we have like the majority. We should have a few more people coming from HHS, so we can wait another couple minutes and see if they come, and then I'll get started.
Perfect.
And then depending on how many people are here, I might hold off on sharing the meeting guidelines until the second half, because if there's not that many people like in the audience, there's like no reason to share until later. Welcome, Patricia. It's so good to see you.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Pretty good.
I'm excited for tonight.
Looking forward to this. I am too. Thank you.
And welcome, Shelley and Sarah.
Good evening, everybody.
We're just waiting a couple minutes to see if a few more people from HHS should come. We just want to let people log in. Welcome, Mark. Welcome, everyone. And welcome, Roberta, I see. All good, Sarah. We're glad that you're with us.
I think the heat is people moving slowly.
Definitely true for me.
It's a hard commute.
Just looking at the list, folks. Shelley, should we promote board members to panelists?
I think so. I know that Robert will be coming on, okay, based on our communications in the past couple hours. But I think we should.
So Julian can be promoted. And we'll start in just a couple minutes.
I promoted Julian and Madeline. Do you see anyone else?
Great, let me take a look.
Oh, wait, Julian's still there. Hold on.
I have a Zoom mechanism that air conditions the rooms that people are in. So if anyone would like me to put it on.
That is very special. Okay, I don't see anybody else right now, but I'll continue looking. Oh, and Katie Bordenaro should also be promoted. Thank you, Mar. Okay.
I don't think I'm a co-host, so I can't promote. So Rosa will be taking care of that. Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Rosa's doing that. Okay. So we'll get started. Just because I don't want to cut in the time of the commission, the New York City Commission for Human Rights, who's going to lead a great workshop that we're all excited about. So tonight's meeting will include a workshop and a dialogue on community anti-racism efforts, which includes a workshop facilitated by Chris Smith and Ryan Dubois from the Commission for this New York City Commission on Human Rights. We'll also have a dialogue on community board anti-racism efforts with board members and leadership from Manhattan Community Boards 1, 2, 4, 6, and 12. So we're really excited to have all of you with us. and to learn from you. And we welcome members of the public. I'm Catherine DeLazaro. I'm the co-chair of Manhattan Community Board 7's Health and Human Services Committee, along with Sheldon Fine. And I want to thank many people for their support in putting this event together, including the commission, Rosa Arenas, who initiated this conversation. So we think Rosa would not be happening if not for Rosa. Stephen Brown, who's the chair of CB7, who is really supportive, Michelle Booker and Jesse Nieves, Christian Cordova, Mark Diller, Community Board Helen Rosenthal and Gail Bruce office for sharing ideas and also advertising the event. And we thank Robert for taking minutes tonight. When we come together as a community, it's important that every one of us contributes to this being a safe, inclusive, and supportive environment for everyone. Before we start tonight's event, I'm going to describe some rules and guidelines for participation and civility at HHS meetings, at every meeting we have. And then the Commission for Human Rights will also be sharing some guidelines for their portion of the workshop. First, I'm going to share a relevant section of Community Board 7's bylaws, which call on board members to treat others with respect and courtesy. Other board members, members of the community, and representatives of agencies, elected official, and all others. The chairperson presiding over a board of a committee meeting shall have the discretion to remove a member, a committee member, or a member of the public from the meeting if the member is disruptive to the functioning of the meeting. So I'm going to break that down with these guidelines. We encourage everyone to listen to each other in order to understand and learn. Attendees' comments in the chat will be visible to panelists only. When members of the public post in chat, comments will only be visible to the panelists. We're a community, so let's please communicate in ways that are respectful, collegial, and professional, and as much as possible in ways that assume goodwill. What's not permitted is personal attacks, so attacking people by name, any bullying or slandering individuals by name, or any derogatory or negative comments towards whole groups is not permitted. We respect and encourage diversity of perspective and opinion. Comments are most effective and easiest to understand when people speak from their own experience. So we encourage that. It's necessary for every participant to follow these guidelines in order to maintain a space that is inclusive, welcoming, and safe for everyone. No one will be interrupted or removed as they speak or post comments in the chat unless they're acting in ways that compromise these guidelines of civility. We don't expect that to happen tonight, and we're glad that you are with us and want to hear from you. So we will have the workshop now for about an hour and a half until 7:30. And then we will hear from representatives from the community boards that are here, 1, 2, 4, 6, and 12, to learn about their anti-racism, equity, and justice work. So we're so excited for tonight. We're so glad you're here. And I'm going to hand it over to Chris and Ryan.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. And thank you, Catherine, and everyone for having us this evening. My name is Chris Smith. I am the Youth Initiatives Lead Advisor at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. I've been working at the Commission for 7 years. My job has really been tasked with community outreach and having a lot of these workshops and conversations with not only adults, but with young people as well. So just being able to have a conversation on achieving to be anti-racist is definitely something that I'm excited about, and definitely looking forward to engaging with each and every one of you on this conversation. And with that being said, I'll let my colleague introduce himself before we get started.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you everybody for being here tonight. I'm really looking forward to an excellent training. Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction as well and the guidelines. So my name is Ryan Dubois. I'm an associate human rights specialist with the Commission. So working in the same department as Chris, primarily focusing on community outreach and education. As a Spanish speaker, I work heavily with the Latinx community as well as with the Indigenous and Native American community of New York City. And I consider this one of our most important presentations that we give, given the, the content, which, in my opinion, has historically been very underlooked, especially in government spaces. And, a topic which is also very heavily under attack in government and educational spaces. So, I consider this one of our most important presentations. So I'm really grateful for everybody's participation and attendance and attention tonight. And so with that said, I will pass it back to Chris to get things started.
Perfect. Thank you, Ryan. And I'm going to get ready to share my screen right now. Yeah, can I get a thumbs up for everyone that can see the screen? Perfect. All right. Yeah, so before, this is our training on protections against anti-Black racism and other forms of discrimination based on race and color. And just to give like our disclaimer at the beginning, this presentation is designed to give an overview over what's covered under the human rights law and should not be like interpreted as an exhaustive outline of what the law entails. So if anyone is looking to have any specific legal questions to be answered or have like specific complaints that they would like to file, they should call our our like info line at 311 and ask for the commission to set up an appointment with our law enforcement bureau. So before we begin, we'd like to ground the space and acknowledge that this is land of the Lenape people, the indigenous tribe that was present in what we know as New York City before the Dutch came and pushed them, try to force them out of the land. We just also want to be sure that we also acknowledge that even though this has happened, the Lenape tribe still is in existence today. There are people from that tribe that are in different parts of the nation, but still come back to New York City to pay homage to their ancestors. So just wanted to ground the space and let it be known that this space was once inhabited by the Lenape tribe, and that they were forced out of their land due to things of genocide, and just how in history and how we speak of this tribe has tried to erase these people as well. Just to go through our agenda today, we're gonna go through like an introduction, talk about the goals of this workshop and the purpose of it, as well as open with the exercise. We'll also discuss different key terms and concepts that are associated with racism and colorism. Talk about the history of racism within New York City and the impacts that it had in New York City, as well as talking about challenging racism in New York City and how not only government is challenging racism, but actions that we are seeing from different communities around New York City to resist racism and resist colorism within New York City and the nation as a whole. And then we'll end with our call to action and giving the information on contacting the commission. So before we start, I'm just gonna go through a couple of different guidelines for the workshop. We do like as much interaction as possible. So if you have any questions or want to respond to any of the prompts that we have in today's workshop, please feel free to unmute and speak. Or you can also utilize the chat if you are comfortable utilizing the chat. We also ask that you be mindful of the length of your responses, because we do know that this can be a topic that everybody has a lot to say about, but we want to make sure that everyone has a voice within this workshop, everyone has the opportunity to participate. So we just want to make sure that everyone has the room and space to participate. And as Catherine said before, we want to make sure that we keep this a safe space. Some people may share some things that may not want to be shared outside the space. So just respecting confidentiality in that regard. What's said here should stay here, as well as maintaining respect even in moments where we disagree. Mentioned before that this topic can be a very heavy and difficult topic to talk about. no matter how many times or that we talk about race, it can always breach to a point of difficulty, but just making sure that we keep in mind that we seek to understand before we criticize. So just kind of like give me like a thumbs up or something on the icon just to say we can agree to some of these guidelines. Okay, perfect, thank you. So let's start. Why are we having this conversation? As city employees, well, just like being like residing in New York City, there's a vast population in New York City of people that comes from many different walks of life. And we must acknowledge that even though New York City is considered a melting pot and considered to be a city that is moving towards progression, we must acknowledge that racism still exists within New York City. And that in order for us to address this issue, we must be honest and like vocal about the racial injustices that we are seeing within the city. And so the purpose of this conversation is to, one, acknowledge that its existence, and that is not unique to the South of this country, but that New York City has its own problems with racism as well. All right, so our workshop goals, we want to make sure that we provide a historical context of like race. Yeah, so providing a historical context of race and color discrimination and how it's impacting New York City, being able to make sure that we provide education on the city human rights law and how people are protected from race and color-based discrimination, and as well as make sure that everyone that's in attendance are equipped to identify what discrimination is and be able to know the proper recourse that they can take in addressing these issues. So at the commission, we are the city's we're a city law enforcement agency that enforces the anti-discrimination law in New York City, known as the human rights law. So if anybody experiences discrimination, whether at work, in housing, or in a public setting, we are the one that receive those complaints and conduct those investigations. We also have authority over city agencies. So city agencies are not exempt from complying with the human rights law, as well as we are also tasked with community education within our community relations bureau, which Ryan and I are a part of, to make sure that people do not only know their responsibilities under the law, but know what their rights are under the law. So just to go over some statistics on why we are having this conversation. So in fiscal year 2020, we received 529 total. We filed 529 complaints. 11% of those complaints were based on race, and 11% seems like a small number, but we have 27 different protected categories. So 27 different reasons why people can file a claim of discrimination under the law. So 11% is a good bit in that regard. And it's our second or third leading area of like complaints of discrimination. And most cases of race-based discrimination that were filed are in the areas of employment. And due to these numbers, this conversation is definitely important, and there's an issue with like race and color discrimination in New York City that must be addressed. So our law is definitely one of the most expansive in the nation, and it prohibits discrimination in employment, in housing, public accommodations, which is just a fancy word for a public place or anyone that provides a public good or service. So restaurants, Uber, taxi cabs, the park, all those are considered public accommodations under the law. We also protect against discriminatory harassment or any form of street harassment that is targeting someone based off of their identity, as well as bias-based profiling by law enforcement, basically meaning that any form of law enforcement officer should not be using their enforcement power as a way to discriminate against other people. So in most cases, the last incident of discrimination must have occurred within the last year. Within like the last year of the final incident of discrimination. And we are really diligent in saying that because not everyone files a complaint initially. So if I experience discrimination, if the first experience that I had was January 25th, and then continued to experience discrimination, and the final act happened today on today, then I'll have until June of 2022 to file a complaint. Yeah, so June 29th of 2022 to file a complaint in most cases. For gender-based harassment, we have like 3 years to file a complaint with the commission. And but in other cases, if it doesn't meet that year, people can file a claim in state court, and they'll have up to 3 years in state court. Oh, as I mentioned before, we have 27 different protected classes, which are basically reasons why people are discriminated against or can claim discrimination. So we'll be talking about race and color today, but if anybody experiences discrimination based on any of these areas, for any of those reasons, you can file a complaint with the commission. And we also, to the right, have some additional protections that are unique to just employment. And we also have protections that are unique to just housing. So if anyone experiences discrimination in these areas, they can come to they can call 311 and set up an appointment with our law enforcement bureau to like have an intake conducted and file a complaint with the commission. Oh, our law is intersectional. So anybody heard of the term intersectionality or familiar with the term intersectionality? Okay, for those that are familiar, anybody want to unmute and say what it is? Okay. That's okay as well. So yeah, intersectionality just basically talk. Oh,
Two issues meet. Where 2 issues meet, whether it's race and sex, age and racism, where they intersect.
yeah, of course. Yeah, correct. So just like we all hold multiple identities, and some of our identities we may experience discrimination on for a combination of reasons. And just to mention, we have like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term of intersectionality in a paper to really detail the experiences of not only just her being Black, but being a woman as well, as really detailing how like the forms of discrimination will intersect based off of the multiple identities that she holds. And we also have Audre Lorde, who identifies as...
Excuse me, Chris, can I interrupt you, please? I'm Bob Espear, CB7. I'll be taking minutes. Are you finishing a previous meeting? Because our meeting is scheduled for 6:30, Community Board 7 host. Am I too early for the
Right.
Health and Human Services, Marge?
Start at 6 o'clock. I don't know if I think it started at 6 o'clock.
All right, so my notice is 6:30. In any event, okay, thank you.
It's us. This is us.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so yeah, Audre Lorde, who is not only Black but lesbian, and yeah, writer, poet, and really an advocate to really detailing, like writing and speaking, regarding like feminism, and just really, again, just an example of like how our multiple identities cause us to face many different forms of discrimination and oppression. And also, we have Bell Hooks as well, like another woman whose work has been related to like feminism and really talking about like the different cultural experiences and how people are targeted with different forms of like discrimination and oppression based off of multiple identities, and as well as Tarana Burke, who coined the term Me Too as it relates to sexual assault and how it impacts women of color, but wasn't given the credit for that term when the Harvey Weinstein allegations like erupted. So just really thinking about how like our multiple identities and how people can experience discrimination based on more than one different characteristics that we went over in our protected categories section. And also, in addition, our law protects against retaliation. So people who are like whether filing a complaint or complying with an investigation should not be met with retaliation. So that includes like people who oppose race and color discrimination or any other form of discrimination, reports or files a complaint, or cooperates with or participates in an investigation. If they are fired from their job because they file a complaint or experience any other forms of retaliation, people can come in and file a retaliation complaint with our office as well. And from here, I'll pass the floor to Ryan to go into our second part of the presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. So this is another very important part of the presentation as well, which is key terms related to racism and colorism. You know, some key terms we've already touched base on, but we're definitely going to delve into it a little more detail here and have some, participatory discussions as well. So before we start that, I also as well just want to mention that we definitely invite everyone's participation, but we also ask folks to just be mindful of the time that you spend sharing as well, because while we know, of course, these are very sensitive subjects, as we mentioned, and we want to hear everyone's personal experience, we also want to be mindful that, it's a group of about 30 people, and we want to make sure that everyone has the equal opportunity to share as we move through the content as well. So just mentioning that as we proceed. And so with that said, we'll get started. So racism, absolutely a word we use a lot, a word that we're going to be using a lot today, something that we all have a very strong idea or opinion about, something that many of us have likely experienced. But how do we define racism? I'll pose the question to the group. What is your definition of racism? Anyone can feel free to either unmute themselves or put their comment in the chat.
Disparate treatment.
Absolutely, disparate treatment, for sure. Anyone want to elaborate on that?
Disparity in access.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Disparities in access to resources, health, education, housing, jobs.
Absolutely. Yes. Disparate access to resources such as education and housing. Yes, definitely. That's very important element for sure. Thank you.
I would build on both of those, the disparate treatment, access, and just say there's disparate impact. And that I think that is inherent to the definition of racism.
Right, disparate impact, definitely. So there may be instances where particular groups are specifically explicitly targeted. And then there may be instances where systems are designed in such a way that maybe on paper, a law or a policy does not explicitly target a group, and yet they are disproportionately affected by that policy. And that's what we call disparate impacts. Absolutely.
Yeah, just to raise a couple responses that are in the chat. Someone mentioned treating another differently. Treating another differently based on the fictional construct of race. Another person put personal, interpersonal, or institutional treatment based on race. And yeah, those
absolutely. So I want to look at this comment as well in the chat about the fictional construct of race. So that kind of segues into the next question here, which is, can racial classifications change over time? And if so, why is that so? Any thoughts on that? Is race static or malleable?
It's changeable because it is intersectional, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there definitely is, right. So we had, yes, definitely a change. Yes, it is malleable. Yeah, so we're definitely gonna look a little bit about, you know, the nature of what race is, from the perspective of it changing over time historically as well. Can we hit the next slide, Chris? Right, so race is essentially what we refer to as a social construction, meaning people created these categories, but they have really very real impacts on our lives. So from a scientific, biological, genealogical, evolutionary perspective, race is not real. There is no significant biological difference, no significant difference in DNA between people of what we identify as different racial groups. Genetically speaking, human beings belong to one human race that have different phenotypes, meaning that we have different, many variations in physical appearances, but with regard to the genotype, the composition of genes and DNA, there's no significant difference between the different racial groups that we have designated, which being that we have designated them ourselves and they change over time makes them a social construction. Now, being that despite them not being real from a scientific perspective, they are very real and have very concrete, tangible effects from a societal perspective. Because despite the scientific unreality of race, social structures and institutions have, of course, largely been built on divisions of racial categories. And so for that reason, we say that race is not real scientifically, but yet race is very real when it comes to the direct impact on people's lives. And so this is a very particularly jarring image, but we do like to use this image to drive home the impact of what was once called scientific racism. So racialization was essentially the process of designating people into particular racial groups. Racialization is the process of defining a racial group, attributing it particular characteristics, and organizing society according to those myths. And so, this process of racialization that we see here was largely part of the scientific racism movement, eugenics being part of that movement, which was actually still largely considered very mainstream in the scientific community, in the early to mid 20th century. And not only in Nazi Germany, not only in fascist countries, but as well the United States as well, Western Europe, largely in the, what we would refer to as the mainstream, scientific community of the Western world. These types of racial theories were embraced and considered mainstream. And, the names of many of the scientists who developed graphs such as these, which were, now debunked theories about different racial groups of humans having distinct evolutionary trajectories from particular animals affecting brain size and intelligence and general function. Many of these scientists, they still have buildings named after them, academic programs named after them, and so this is one example of how the society we live in today has absolutely been influenced by this history, and how the social perceptions that we also have, independent of whether we're involved in the scientific community or not, often stem from society being organized based on ideas such as these.
Yeah, just to address a question real quick in the chat. This presentation is not available on our website because we're constantly editing. It's a living document that we constantly edit just based off of the times. And as you see in this presentation, you'll kind of know why that it's constantly edited. But yeah, so unfortunately it's not available online, on our website.
If I could just interject, and I'm so sorry for interrupting. I do just want to make clear though that it is live right now as part of a community board meeting, and it's being recorded. And so this version will be online. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you so much. So just moving on to the next slide. So we've seen what racialization looked like at a certain time in history. Fortunately, advances in science, have caused a significant shift in the scientific community to invalidate those types of racist theories and to validate, the perspective that we started out with of there being no significant genealogical difference between different racial groups. And that being said, racialization still occurs today. And so we see some of those examples here. So these are some stories that appeared in media outlets. New York Times, ICE arrests hundreds in Mississippi raids targeting immigrant workers. So this is one example. How are immigrants racialized? When we think of immigrants, what picture comes to mind? When we think of immigrants from particular regions, with regard to what's often referred to now as the border crisis, when we think of immigrants from Mexico or Central America, there's a significant a complex process that takes place in our political establishment and in our media that shapes how we view immigrants and how they should be treated and how we should navigate our borders. And that's all part of racialization. Send her back chance at Republican Representative Ilhan Omar. So again, asking sort of the question of who belongs in the country, who deserves American identity, who deserves to hold public office. So again, this kind of chant is targeting the representative on the basis that she's an immigrant, on the basis that she belongs to a particular religion or a particular nationality, which can be racialized as un-American. Washington Post headline here, we see Asian American doctors and nurses fighting racism and the coronavirus. So this is really getting at the point that, we are experiencing a significant wave of xenophobia and hate crimes against Asian Americans because of stereotypes associated with the coronavirus, and that also being something that has been perpetuated by the political establishment as well. And also, this is not the first time in American history that, or, of course, history in general, that a sickness or a virus or a disease has been racialized and associated with a particular group through scapegoating. Washington Times, ICE, shut out of border talks, warns Democrats' plans would free thousands of criminals. So again, we see the criminalization of immigrants linked to racialization. USA Today, women wearing hijabs were not allowed to board a ferry in New York City, citing a security issue. So again, we see, the racialization and criminalization of particular immigrant groups or particular religion. The racialization of a particular style of dress, a certain item of clothing being deemed a security threat that's due to racialization as well. From NBC News, man makes anti-Asian statements before trying to punch woman in Midtown. So again, another example of anti-Asian bias and xenophobia resulting from stereotypes associated with the coronavirus. As well, from the New York Times, scrutiny of social distancing policy as 35 of 40 arrested are Black. And we'll speak more in detail about, the criminal justice system and law enforcement later in the presentation. But there is a significant racialization that occurs within policing as well. So, also in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, who do we think about who is been primarily affected by the coronavirus? Why do we have that association? Has the government associated resources adequately given that scenario? And in that context as well, how do we utilize policing to control or manipulate society? That's all part of racialization as well. So when it comes to the idea of prejudice, this is something that, again, as well, most people would be able to define very strongly, very accurately. And yet, however, the way that prejudice often functions is sometimes harder to put a finger on. And so, this image here is actually from a test that was developed. Escapes me whether it was Harvard or Princeton. I believe it was Harvard. But essentially, this is like an implicit bias test. So this test is essentially where a series of images comes on the screen and the participant is required to immediately associate that image with something good or something bad. And essentially, these images are typically of or associated with either African Americans or European Americans or white Americans. And so this test is basically attempting to measure the degree to which the individual does have prejudice or bias. And so a test like this is very important because, you know, a person may in their conscious mind say, well, I'm not prejudiced, I don't stereotype, I'm not racist. In fact, the majority of people would very likely say that. And yet we may subconsciously carry prejudices and carry stereotypes, and those may even manifest as we navigate society without us even consciously realizing it. So, you know, this test is really meant to bring that to the surface. You know, even we've had folks at the commission, people who have dedicated their entire lives to racial justice, who have taken the test and seen that it illustrated that they had a preference and association towards European Americanness. And so, you know, and that's to say as well that this is something that can affect anyone, you know, not, you know, we think of racism and prejudice as, you know, extremist groups and things like that, but the nature of it is that it actually can manifest in very implicit ways in anyone in society. So what is privilege? This is an important question as well. The commission, we define privilege as an advantage enjoyed by a group of people that is not available to everyone. A privilege that is not earned, a privilege that is given in the context of racial privilege, and, you know, through your skin tone or you know, facial features, etc. Proximity to whiteness, you know, in the context of white supremacy in American society being associated with privilege. And so I'm curious as well if folks would like to comment on what these two images are that we see here and why we would choose these images in the context of our discussion about privilege.
Isn't it the hoodie?
It is the hoodie, yes. And someone said in the chat as well, who can wear a hoodie? So in particular, who are these people and why is the hoodie relevant?
One is Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and the other is, I believe, the mother of Trayvon Martin.
Right, that's exactly correct. So we chose this this image, essentially because when it comes to racialization and privilege, here we can see the racialization of an article of clothing with regard to the hoodie and Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin was shot and killed because, as a young Black boy, I'm going to say young Black boy because he was not a man, he was a boy. As a young Black boy wearing a hoodie, that article of clothing, which is perfectly normal, acceptable article of clothing that anyone in society would wear, was weaponized against him in order to criminalize him as a young Black male wearing a hoodie. Whereas we see the contrast with Mark Zuckerberg, who is able to not only wear a hoodie without that association, but in fact is celebrated for it and actually given a particular status to say that he is so privileged, that he is so successful, that he can actually walk into a corporate boardroom where anyone else would be required to be wearing a full suit and tie and loafers, but he can walk in wearing a hoodie because of the privilege that comes with not having the association of that racialization and that criminalization. There's not any danger. To the contrary, there's actually benefit. There's a certain appeal, there's a certain status that sends the message that I'm so privileged, I can show up here wearing a hoodie, and not only does it not affect me, it actually benefits me. It's almost like branding. So this is why we use the example of the hoodie in the context of privilege. I'm just taking a look at the chat as well before I continue the discussion. So I see an interesting question about the use of masks. I think that's a very interesting question. I'm not necessarily gonna venture to answer that. Just because I'm not really sure how to take that into the context of the subject material at this moment, but I think that is definitely an interesting question. I would actually take that comment and just route the attention back to the issue of mask enforcement, because I think that's, you know, something that was mentioned previously that I think is very telling with regard to, you know, when it comes to masks and mask enforcement, which communities are, you know, which communities are those where the police actually went distributing masks to people who were unmasked versus which communities were those where we saw police, targeting and arresting and confronting people for not wearing masks? To me, that's the more relevant question when it comes to mask wearing. So finally, we've had a significant discussion about racism up until this point. And then finally, we will provide our official commission definition of how we view racism, which is the use of power held by a privileged group to perpetuate oppression, exclusion, and discrimination based on race. So, we consider that a pretty comprehensive definition that definitely incorporates all of the elements that were mentioned by, folks in the earlier discussion. So, again, thank you for those contributions. Oh, and I'll also mention the image that we're looking at here is actually Stuytown in downtown Manhattan. And we put this here because, access to housing in particular was an example that was mentioned. And, it just so happens that Stuyvesant Town, upon its creation, did have racially exclusionary covenants, which barred Black and Jewish people from living there. So we'll further break down what racism looked like and how it plays out in society. And the two of the really primary ways that we want to look at are institutional racism and structural racism. Now, typically, I don't really like to read font off the slide word by word, but I do that on this slide because I think these definitions are very important to look at word by word. So institutional, we have systemic policies, laws, and practices within socioeconomic and political institutions of civil society that provide advantages to the dominant group based on race, such as slavery, segregation, sterilization, redlining, and profiling. Contrast that to structural racism, systemic factors that perpetuate over generations racial inequities in socioeconomic and political structures of society. For example, mass incarceration of Black and Latino men, poverty, lack of mobility to the middle class, unemployment. So this correlation is extremely relevant because one of the arguments to debunk or to attempt to debunk the existence of racism, to say, yeah, racism is over and it doesn't exist, is to point at institutional policies, or in other words, the explicitly racist policies of the past and say, well, those policies no longer exist. Slavery is over, segregation is over, civil rights movement won, racism is done, right? That's only half of the picture. The other half is structural racism. So if you have a society, if you have a country which is founded on such hyper racist institutions, such as slavery, such as racial segregation, some of the policies that we see here, housing segregation, segregation in schools, forced sterilization of women so that they cannot continue to give birth. Redlining, in other words, the division of neighborhoods, politically and economically to divert resources away from communities of color and towards white communities, or to help white people escape lower income communities and get out of cities into, wealthier suburbs, through a variety of government supported mechanisms, government funded mechanisms, various, like we saw as well in the previous example, exclusionary covenants for particular housing developments, things like that. That being the foundation of the construction of a society, the inevitable result is the structural racism, where even in the absence of the explicitly racist policies, apparently, seemingly neutral policies are actually still deeply racist because they perpetuate the explicitly racist policies of the past. They do nothing to address the racism of the past, and in a very often implicit, subtle way, they drastically exacerbate existing inequalities, to the extent that New York City today actually has, for example, a school system which is more racially segregated than it was in previous decades. Despite the perception by much of society that society is actually becoming more integrated. So this is the link between institutional and structural racism. Blockbusting was something that was mentioned as well in the chat. Absolutely. So, again, further government-sponsored and sanctioned mechanisms to devalue communities of color and to perpetuate segregation. Absolutely. So colorism. this is another extremely important thing as well, discrimination based on lightness or darkness of the skin, and the idea of passing. So, we mentioned colorism as well, because of course, racism primarily refers to discrimination between racial groups, from someone of one racial group against another. But then we also have colorism, which, also definitely does occur between racial groups, but also occurs within racial groups. And this is, the result of colonialism and white supremacy as well. The glorification and the standard setting of European beauty standards, and the demonization of, features of people of color, in particular African features. And we can see a couple examples here. In the top two photos, we have Beyonce on the left-hand side appearing in a standard photo, and on the right-hand side, Beyonce being extremely whitewashed in a L'Oreal ad. Her hair made blonde, her skin drastically lightened, and her facial features made to look more European than African. And on the bottom, we have a different scenario, which is the baseball player who was very prominent in the 90s, Sammy Sosa, who actually himself chose to subject himself to skin lightening. And this, again, going to the concept of passing, of privilege being associated with proximity to whiteness. And another important concept as well to mention is internalized racism. An individual's internalized beliefs about their own inferiority because of the messages constantly, reiterated and that they are bombarded with by society. So, that's the nature of colorism as well. I'm not sure. Do we have the capacity to show this video, Chris?
I wasn't going to. I mean, we can, but
yeah, it may be better not to, just in the interest of time, actually, because we are about halfway through our time as it is. So basically, I'll just provide a brief summary, which is that Joy DeGray, who is a prominent feminist, anti-racist author and academic, basically tells a story about how she is with a family member who is significantly more lighter skinned than her, and how they're shopping together in the supermarket, and her family member essentially, checks out, pays for her groceries without any issue. And then when she approaches the same cashier, she basically experiences a very, very hostile attitude and is requested to provide various forms of ID because the cashier suspects that she's going to give a bad check. And so this is a form of basically what is also called microaggression. And a microaggression essentially being something that, again, is more implicit, not necessarily an explicit act of racism, not somebody insulting your race, calling you a racial epithet, but nonetheless treating you differently and adopting a hostile stance towards you on the basis of your race, but without explicitly stating necessarily that is the basis. And so, this is one example. Another example could be telling someone that is presumed to be of immigrant descent, that complimenting their English, like, oh, you speak English so well, even though that person may very well have been born and raised in the United States, or may not be multilingual at all even, or saying like, oh, you're so eloquent for, someone of your group or something like that, different comments that essentially, again, the individual saying it might not intend or even realize are actually degrading and racist, and yet that is the impact that they have.
I think that's compliments.
So we also want to look at white supremacy and white nationalism. Again, I'm going to read these definitions because I think they're important. White supremacy, a socialization process that teaches people, backhanded comments someone said on the chat. Yeah, absolutely. That's, definitely part of microaggressions. So white supremacy, a socialization process that teaches people to believe, accept, or live out superior societal definitions of self, and to fit into and live out superior social roles. And these behaviors define and normalize the race construct and its outcome, white supremacy. White nationalism being the belief that countries or regions should be defined by a white racial identity and white racial hegemony. In the US, is also about maintaining a demographic majority, political, cultural, and economic dominance. So this is important as well, because sometimes we can conflate the two. Sometimes we can think of white supremacy and think immediately of neo-Nazi groups, extremist groups. However, white supremacy does not have to be part of an extremist group to be part of society. In fact, white supremacy is constantly around us all the time. It permeates virtually all realms of society, from the curriculum we learn about in school, again, from many of the policies that are implemented, political and economic policies that largely direct the direction of society. We looked at examples in the media. We looked at examples in law enforcement. So white supremacy really is the socialization process that makes whiteness almost invisible, because it's considered what's normal, it's considered what's mainstream, it's considered what's desirable, and provides an othering process to anything else. That is white supremacy. White nationalism is more of that explicit stance of, yes, we want a demographic majority. We believe Western civilization is superior. These are the heroes and symbols that we want because these are what we think are best. But you don't necessarily have to be a white nationalist to be participating in and perpetuating white supremacy. And, so we provide a series of images associated with that as well. On the left-hand side, we have a statue of Christopher Columbus in Columbus Circle. And we include that in this discussion because we think that that is an extremely poignant example of the presence of white supremacy, which is so accepted that it's sitting in the middle of a public square for everyone to see every single day. We see the example of Christopher Columbus, who, basically undisputed historical record at this point illustrates that Christopher Columbus, when he did land on the island of Hispaniola, immediately began to enslave, violently maim, brutalize, and murder the indigenous people that were there, to the point that it was so brutal that he was even, shocking to his other European counterparts, and he was actually eventually detained and sent back to Europe for being such a brutal despot. And yet, he is a figure that is very widely and largely celebrated. Again, to the point that, there are not only this one, but multiple statues of him within New York City, and a federal holiday, and a lot of mythology that follows him as well as one of the, founders and originators of, the United States as it is. And I think it's also important to note as well, I'm speaking on this personally as an Italian American, Italian New Yorker myself, the way that symbol is largely embraced by the Italian community in particular. And I think that's relevant because of the history of the Italian community having been an exploited and discriminated against immigrant group itself upon the original, immigrant wave of Italians to America. And it's the community's social ascension and gaining proximity to whiteness in order to, gain that status, that association, with whiteness and white privilege. The figure of Columbus largely being a tool in that process. And then on the right-hand side, we also have an image of the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys being a very prominent, alt-right white supremacist group. And this image is actually taken from the night that there was actually an attack against a series of, politically liberal identifying protesters. And some of those who participated in that attack are actually, currently either in court or have been sentenced for that assault. And then, of course, we have the instance of the invasion of the Capitol in January, as an example as well of the mobilization of white supremacist and white nationalist forces, which, mobilized so strongly, having felt so threatened that they were actually willing to attempt to violently overthrow the government in an insurgency in order to pursue, the goal of white nationalism in the face of what was perceived as, whatever the perception was, demographic changes or corruption or whatever the case may be. But, of course, we use this example to say that when we talk about white supremacy and white nationalism, we are not simply talking about a series of, survivalist groups in the woods in some random place in the country. We're talking about a force that has extremely deep-rooted, widespread roots, which are also supported by many elements of the political establishment. And with that said, I will pass it back to Chris.
Thank you, Ryan. And so this next part, we're going to be analyzing some recent events of like white supremacy and white nationalism that manifest in New York City, as well as discussing like some of the historical contexts of like institutional structural racism, and discuss what can not only we do like as representatives of the city, but just thinking about people in the community as a whole can do to address issues of racism. So as we start, you can see the image listed here of the silent protest that was conducted by the NAACP in 1917 in response to the East St. Louis riots, which resulted in many like Black people being killed and hung, and killed and lynched. So just thinking about and just using this image as the fact that in New York City, there's always been a form of resistance against any forms of oppression and discrimination and forms of hate. Providing resistance is not a new thing to New York City, even though New York City still has a history of racism. So just thinking of the indigenous history, as you mentioned before, of like this land being inhabited by the Lenape indigenous people of New York City until the Dutch came and conducted what they called a purchase, which the Lenape people interpreted as gifts because their beliefs were that they did not have liberty over land or air to even like promote a transaction of the land or the air. They viewed these Dutch colonizers as people that were willing to, that they opened the space to share the space, rather than the intention of like, and viewed what they gave them as gifts rather than a transaction for purchase. And by the 1800s, most of the Native Americans were forced out of New York City. And in 2010, a census showed that the city had the largest Native American population with 112,000. So just really thinking about, again, when we talk about the Lenape tribe, it's usually talk about indigenous people, period. We usually talk about them in past tense, but we want to make sure that we use this workshop as to talk about that they are still very much here amongst us, and that this land was theirs, is theirs, and they were here before colonizers have like committed forms of genocide against those people. And just also going over like how different institutions that are existing today have profited from slavery. So thinking of like corporations such as New Life, JP Morgan Chase, and Bank of America have benefited from slavery through accepting slaves as collateral for people that had to default on their loans, and just even like profiting off of slave labor. And as well as some of like institutions of learning that are still standing today, such as Columbia University, and how some of their presidents have owned slaves. And this is just going into the conversation of how we're seeing different schools offer scholarships to those that were descendants of, the descendants of slaves, and just really bringing up the conversation of reparations, which has always been a topic of conversation, but just really exploring what reparations is, and how people who have caused harm to cause harm to communities can play a role in assisting in the healing of those communities. Just as like a saying, like reparations does not look like one way. So offering collegiate scholarships is not the only, it's not like a set form of reparations, or even like people from outside of the Black community, the term shouldn't be determining what reparations are for them. It's a multifaceted thing. It's still being explored and discovered on, since we are finally beginning to acknowledge how like these different institutions have benefited from slavery, and how that how like the institutional, how that form of institutional racism, as Ryan mentioned, resulted in the structural racism, which are basically the aftermath of the different policies that were put in place. Also, just to kind of talk about some of the different Black communities that were created after after slavery was abolished in New York City in 1827. You had Newtown, which is present Elmhurst in Queens. Again, just one of the first Black communities to arise and like after slavery was abolished. Had its own it had its own church and different schools, and it was a thriving Black community. But in the 1920s, almost 1930s, the African Methodist Church was under pressure to move and sold the property, as land was considered to be very valuable for like businesses and industries. So just really wanted to bring awareness that like displacing of different communities, and in this particular context, displacing Black communities is not a new phenomenon and has always been a thing. And also, I think that it was probably within like the last decade that they actually found remainants of one of the residents of this community, and as well like just finding these different things and being able to acknowledge that these communities have existed, as well as going on to Seneca Village, which existed between 1825 and 1857, near Central Park West 85th Street entrance. This was the largest community of Black property owners, and majority of the community was Black, and I think the rest were Irish and German, like small percentage. But when Central Park was being built, the residents were displaced and their land was seized. So again, just another example of displacing Black community members and like seizing their land. As well as Weeksville in Brooklyn, which is a sub-community within Crown Heights, which was founded by a free man, James Weeks, who purchased it from another free Black man. And that community provided refuge for those escaping slavery from the South, even provided refuge from those that were fleeing persecution from the New York City draft riots in 1863, which was committed because people were not interested in fighting in a civil war to like assist in abolishing slavery and freeing like Black people, because of, again, just thinking of the myth that we even hear today when we think of like quote unquote newcomers. They're here they're going to take our jobs, they're going to take opportunities away from us. So it will be in our interest for slavery to still exist, so they will not take those opportunities away from us. So just thinking about just even today of just how that community was not only created for like self-determination and Black liberation, but also a place of refuge for Black communities to flee persecution. As well as today, the Hunter Fly Roadhouses are the only remnants of Weeksville, are considered a New York City landmark. And there's the Weeksville Heritage Center that's there that was risking closure, but through community donations and other sources of funding, the center was able to stay open. And for those that never been, I don't live too far from there because I live in Brooklyn. I'll definitely recommend people check it out. This current administration, Mayor de Blasio has gone through like an ambitious agenda to create a equitable city, but as I mentioned before, racism exists in New York City, and there is more work to do. And just to kind of open for a few different responses for our transition, is like racism, white supremacy, or white nationalism do you believe it's on the rise? in New York City? And if so, why do you think so? And just in the interest of time, we were reserving for like a couple responses, like one to two responses. And Ryan, if you see something in the chat that I don't, feel free to raise that up as well.
With this racial hate crime, you begin to feel that there are different forms of racism that are sort of sprouting up. So I would think that it's expanding its net, so to speak, that it's not just one group versus the rest, but there are many groups that are being targeted. So I would tend to think that, the subtleties aside, I think it is on the rise. And not just towards towards Asian communities, but other communities as well. So, you know, a lot of these things are not reported. So you never come to know about it because a lot of these crimes are not violent crimes. So, you know, the data is not there yet for us to make a judgment.
Okay. Yeah, most definitely. And thank you for raising that point. Yeah, yes, yeah, that's definitely a good point. Okay, Mar?
I mean, yes, it's certainly on the rise, but I feel like it always existed and we're just hearing about it more. It's a fact that racists have been emboldened since 2016, more than, probably more than, since slavery, right? People haven't really shown their ugly on the outside the way that we're seeing it these days in a very, very long time. So I feel like people think it's okay almost now to be against certain groups and to other people who are different from them, which is really bad. And certainly we're seeing in the Asian community, but in the Black community, honestly, this is nothing new. That's all.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Thank you for that. And just really thinking about, just how racism, like I said, always has existed, but now we're forced to like watch it and view it. And even just thinking about the pandemic, us being like isolated inside and just seeing a lot of different things happening and us just being forced to sit there and watch has really created a lot of awareness as well. Oh, Catherine, you had anything you wanted to mention? I think I saw a hand up.
As I was thinking about that question, also listening to the comments, I remembered that when HHS wrote a resolution that had to do with condemning hate crimes, I read a report by the Department of Homeland Security that said that participation in, I don't remember the technical term, but it's something like white extremist groups, like violent white extremist groups, has increased dramatically, like in the last few years. So that would be like the second category that you mentioned, the white nationalism. So that those groups have increased according to the United States Department of Homeland Security. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you for that. And it's in the interest of time because these are definitely great responses and kind of like why we had that question up there, just to talk about like, is it on the rise? And a lot of the responses definitely like hint towards like it is rising, but it's also something that's always existed, but it's just now being exposed more frequently than we're used to seeing like in decades past. Well, it's not as hot, like it's highlighted more now than it was in decades past. So just go through some of the analysis of like recent events. There was a salon on the Upper East Side that banned employees to wear like hairstyles that are associated with with Black people. So natural hairstyles such as afros or box braids at work. And this was a part of the settlement agreement. The salon had to partner with New York City-based styling schools specializing in natural hairstyles or hairstyles that are associated with Black people, as well as train employees to style that kind of hair, as well as providing like a multicultural internship program. So again, as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that community, if anyone has caused harm in a particular community, they play a role in helping that community heal as well. So this is just one of the examples of like some of our different settlements that we look at the law through like a restorative lens rather than just being punitive. Yeah. Well, another incident with a product store in the city. They displayed a product that resembled blackface imagery, which has always been used to dehumanize Black people, and as well as perpetuate some of the white supremacist notions that even take place today. So yeah, back in February 2020, settled with Prada regarding the racist imagery, where they had to invest in programs to combat like go through training of like the human rights law and being able, and as well as promote like diversity and inclusion, its business, as well as addressing like its like board positions to make sure they are promoting diversity and inclusion. So again, and this wasn't just unique to this store, but really Prada stores like worldwide, we were able to like facilitate a settlement of like this magnitude. So yeah, just being sure that, and I'm gonna say like 5,000 times, these those that harm those communities are playing a role in helping it heal. And yeah, just incident with Amy Cooper, calling the police on Christian Cooper, based on him asking to like leash her dog. And again, just really goes into the point of weaponizing police against black and brown people, and just everyone seen. Well, I'm not going to assume everyone saw the video, but the video of her like saying, "I'm gonna just say I'm a white woman and this Black man attacking me," and that being somewhat of a quote. Just again, like weaponizing police due to what we have been seeing with like police misconduct and police brutality targeting like Black and brown communities. And in another like recent event, just on March 29th of this year, like a 65-year-old woman was brutally attacked in broad daylight on her way to church in Chelsea, and attack raised questions about what appeared to be a bystander's failure. To be like the bystander, the failure of the bystander to help. So just really seeing like different incidents targeting like different communities and just like really like how like Asian Americans have been like targeted based on racialized based on the COVID-19 pandemic. And due to this, the commission created a COVID-19 response team to respond to incidents of discrimination if they like that are related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And based on some of the statistics that we received like 625 different related incidents. 205 of those incidents were anti-Asian related. And that was based on, that was data from February of 2020 to the end of 2020. So just seeing like the rapid like incline from like anti-Asian incidents from 30 in 2019 to over 600 in 2020. And I'll pass it back to Ryan to go through the impacts of racism in a few of these areas.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm noticing that we have about 10 more minutes left. So I'm actually gonna ask, rather than go through the remainder of the slides, I'm actually gonna try to provide a summarization of the slides, just going through each of these points, because we won't have time to go through each section individually if we go through all the slides. So that's just due to a time constraint. So, looking at the impact of racism on New Yorkers, we've touched on a lot of these things individually. Now we want to provide, a few more specific in-depth examples. So criminal justice system and law enforcement. We've discussed a variety of those examples. One particular example that we highlight is what were known as the Central Park Five, that are now referred to as the Exonerated Five. The five at the time young boys who were essentially accused and convicted of a heinous violent crime of brutal rape of a woman in Central Park, who later were exonerated by DNA evidence, which proved that they did not do that. But it's not only the arrest and the conviction, it's also the nature of the social perception of that incident. You had politicians referring to them as super predators, of characterizing primarily young Black men in the city as what they called super predators. So highly dehumanizing language. To this day, sometimes you will hear law enforcement agents use terms like wolf packs to refer to young groups of kids. Again, animalistic, dehumanizing language. We can look at historically the hyper criminalization of certain drugs and the sometimes disproportionate enforcement of certain drugs along racial lines. So we can look at laws that attacked, the use and distribution of crack versus heroin, and the different uses of those in different communities. We can look at the hypercriminalization of even low-level marijuana possession, resulting in people spending sometimes decades in prison. The fact that people are still spending time in prison right now for low-level, small marijuana possession charges, while the marijuana cannabis industry suddenly turns into a legalized industry where more privileged people with more access to capital are making millions or billions of dollars on that industry. As well as, of course, the unequal distribution of force by law enforcement and the targeting of communities of color, often explicitly. The policy of stop and frisk, which was made illegal but continued to be, not only implemented, but many police officers have come out and released testimony that they were being specifically told to arrest men of color using stop and frisk, a banned policy, and using a quota system, which as well had been made illegal as well. So there's a variety of ways in which the criminal justice system and law enforcement has impacted communities of color through racism. Housing, we've looked at quite a few of these examples as well. We have examples in the presentation that show, we've looked at Stuytown. We've also seen Jackson Heights in Queens. We can look at Parkchester in the Bronx. Many communities which were designed and created to be, stable, safe middle class housing exclusively for white people, and essentially, banning and excluding people of color and Black communities in particular. Children and family services. We can also see, the unequal enforcement along racial lines in this instance as well. We can see the, hyper vigilance of parents, particularly parents of color, particularly low-income parents. We can see children being institutionalized unnecessarily, being separated from their parents, and the, significant family division that can cause as well. With regard to education, as I mentioned previously, New York City not only is more segregated now than it has been in previous decades, it's also been consistently rated as one of the top 3 most segregated school systems in the country. And I think that's also important as well, because we can also look at the resource distribution between schools as well. We can see neighborhoods where a predominantly white public school will have stellar funding, amazing, academic programs, arts and sports programs. But we can see sometimes on the same street or on an adjacent street, another public school with very poor funding, very few programs, particularly with Black and brown student body. And so we can also see the effect of racism in education as well. Health, we can see an impact in, how different communities receive health services. In particular, how people of color experience the health system. Historically, there has been a perception because of racism by the medical community that people of color and Black people in community in particular were less susceptible to pain. And this resulted in a lot of dehumanization as well. We can also look at, for example, the taking down of the statue in Central Park of Dr. Marion Sims, who is kind of referred to as the godfather of gynecology, but who developed the field by experimenting on enslaved Black women without using anesthesia. And that's kind of, an example of a historical root of a trend that continues to this day. Black women have tended to experience higher rates of maternal mortality. And that's largely attributed to the fact that, doctors, nurses, and other people in the medical establishment simply do not believe or take seriously or take into account the feedback that they receive from Black women in particular, but also, other people of color about their pain and their experience in the healthcare system. Infrastructure, we can also definitely see with regard to the creation of infrastructure in New York City in general, inequities as well with regard to how zoning works, where pollution is directed, where sanitation facilities are located, where homeless shelters and drug treatment centers are placed. The example, for example, I happen to live in the South Bronx where we have Yankee Stadium, which is one of the most profitable sports franchises in the world, situated in the middle of the poorest county in the entire country, where basically, that real estate is being used. And the Yankees actually acquired that property very cheaply and pay no taxes on it. And so, you have an example where real estate is being used to essentially siphon profit out of the community without giving any of it back. And there's a lot of examples of that throughout the city. And I actually can't see the last item, employment, because the closed captioning was blocking it. Employment, we can also see a great deal of employment discrimination that takes place. We can see discrimination on the basis of, of course, someone's appearance and stereotyping and prejudice. We have observed discrimination on the basis of the name that may appear on a resume. We have seen instances where a person's job application may be denied on the basis of the assumption about their identity based on the name on the application, although they have the exact same qualifications of somebody with a more, white sounding, Anglo-Saxon sounding name applying to the same job with the same qualifications. And also with regard to, for example, city agencies, we see that there is, substantial diversity within employment in the city. But we also see that in many agencies, and a few agencies in particular, the higher up you go, the more racially segregated it becomes. So in other words, you have many people of color represented in city government, but the higher you go up in supervisor and management and top level, commissioner positions, et cetera, the less representation of people of color and women that there will be. And so, that's an example of how racism impacts employment as well. With that said, I'm gonna pass it back to Chris just to finish up with the last few minutes. Unfortunately, again, we didn't have time to get through quite all the slides, so I'll leave it to you, Chris, to conclude with the information that you think is most poignant and important.
Thank you, Ryan. So, just as like a close and I think I saw like a question in the Q&A section. Yes, we are a city agency. The Commission on Human Rights, we enforce the anti-discrimination law in New York City. And just with that being said, not only do we enforce the law, we have conducted we do community outreach, like where we had hosted like different forums and events addressing issues such as racism, and in response to many different like events of racism. So yeah, we're not only conducting these workshops, but we're also hosting events and making sure that community is feeling heard and are able to share their experiences of discrimination with us. But with that being said, us as city employees aren't the only ones resisting racism, but we have community as well. Because as we know as listed in our call to action, racism is still pervasive in New York City. It still exists. It is not unique to the South. It is something that is very much here that needs to be addressed and challenged and resisted against. And it is a responsibility of all of us here to make sure that we are addressing issues of racism within the spaces that we hold, making sure that we are diligent in having these conversations with each other, even in moments of disagreement, but we are sure to like have these conversations, be made aware of our unconscious biases, which if exercised upon through the power that we may hold in our like in our professional capacities could be forms of like racism based off of how we exercise our unconscious bias within the positions that we hold. So just making sure that we are all doing our role to be diligent in addressing the issues of racism in New York City. And if anybody has gone through any form of discrimination, you can call 311 and ask for the Commission on Human Rights, and it will be forwarded to our info line, or you can call our info line directly at 212-416-0197. And you can also go to our website at nyc.gov/human rights to not only like see some of the literature that we have available, but to also stay up to date on some of the different some of our newest settlements. Also get further information on your rights protections that's covered under the human rights law. And it's the end. We usually end with a quote from Shirley Chisholm. In the end, anti-Black, anti-female, male, or all forms of discrimination are equivalent to the same thing, anti-humanism. So just as a reiteration that these forms of discrimination and these forms of hate are anti-human, and we all have a responsibility to stand and resist against these forms of oppression. And yeah, and that concludes our presentation. If there's any questions, or if there are any time for questions, I'll leave that at the discretion of Catherine. But again, just want to like thank you all for having us. This was definitely an enriching conversation as always, and I always appreciate the different responses that we receive. And as I mentioned before, this is one of my favorite workshops to facilitate because I always take away something new from these conversations. So definitely like appreciate you all for staying tuned in with us and engaging in conversation with us.
Thank you so much, Chris and Ryan. That was absolutely fantastic. It was informative and it was insightful and it was clear. And I appreciate how you took every comment and responded to each one. So thank you so much for that. And the New York City Commission on Human Rights, I also just want to say and recognize how important it is, the work that you're doing on so many levels. In the work that we've done on Community Board 7, we've really relied on your expertise so much, and just really grateful for your presence with this and the work with this presentation, but just all the work that you're doing. So thank you so much. And we don't expect you to stay for the second half, for the second event, but of course you're welcome to stay for as long as you like. Are there any other comments or questions for them from those who are here before we move on to the second portion?
Okay. May I?
See a few hands.
Yeah.
Sorry. Great presentation. I think it's very, very useful information. I would make one recommendation, which is, I think this should be shared more widely. I don't know what mechanism you can think about, but I mean, the fact that this session is being recorded, that's good. But beyond that, if it is made available in some form or the other on CCHR's website, that might be a good way to do that. And the second thing that I'm going to recommend is, and I'm going to, as a co-chair, and my co-chair Katie Stokes is here as well, I'm happy to invite you to come and speak to CV4 at some point, and we will be in touch. So I think this should be kind of a citywide something that you can do. So if the community boards are not reaching out to you, I would recommend that you reach out to them.
Oh yeah, most definitely. And we do workshops for some of the different community boards. Ryan is our full-time staffer in Manhattan. I work citywide, but before I worked citywide, I was like stationed in Queens. So we do conduct these presentations in many other different community boards. Some of us have some relationships with community boards already existing, where we kind of reach out proactively. Sometimes they reach out to us as well. So we're definitely always open to conducting these presentations in other community boards as well. Ryan, you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, not really, just reiterating that you know, we're eager to give these presentations. We welcome any opportunity you know, to deliver the presentations whenever we're invited to do so. So if you're interested in, you know, in hosting another presentation for your board, if you know, community organizations that may be interested in receiving the presentation, or you know, at any of your contacts, any city agency, you know, like I said, we're always eager to give the presentation. There's no limit on how many we can give, anything like that. So any ideas, any contacts, any opportunities that you know about, please let us know, and we will definitely be happy to do that. And it's not just Chris and I, we have various staff members that are trained to give this presentation as well.
And I'll put my email in the chat for anybody that may be interested in a follow-up. Just feel free to reach out to my email. My email goes straight to my phone as well, so I'm very accessible. Just to put that out there. So you can reach out to me, aosmith@cchr.nyc.gov. And if you would want to invite us to give this presentation at your respective community board, we would definitely open to do so. If I can't do it myself, or Ryan can't do it, we can definitely like forward it to our team that could as well. And Doug, you have a question?
I just wanted to say thank you so much. I think this is the second or third time I've gone through your training, and as far as I'm concerned, I can't do it enough. And I've learned something new each time, and I've seen how you've updated the course with each subsequent training. So I'm just very grateful, and I just think, you know, it's the repetition because of all the years of the unconscious bias. There's just years of sort of deprogramming it, and like I said, I just look forward to the next ones, and I'm grateful.
Thank you. Really appreciate that you definitely taken like something new from it as well. And yeah, and Ryan also put his email in the chat as well, so you can reach out to him also. And we definitely appreciate that recommendation of like expanding our reach and seeing if we can like stream like our different workshops more. And sometimes we do like based on like stream different workshops or events like on our like Facebook page and our different like social media handles. But yeah, I think that's really as far as we can go, just because it's an existing document that's constantly being updated. We don't want to just put a live one on there just to kind of like remove it, because we have a lot of content on our website as well. And so just that is also like into consideration. But I really do appreciate that feedback, and we definitely like give that back to our team. Yeah, you can. Varen, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right.
No, you're pretty close. That's okay. I was just going to add, even if you don't share the entire presentation, the information that you guys have about City of New York is so very helpful. The history part of it, right? And so even if that can be shared, it's a resource that a lot of people don't quite recognize. I mean, there's so many things people don't recognize. You take it for granted. We very casually say that America was invented by Columbus or discovered by Columbus. It was always there. It had to be found. It wasn't discovered by anybody in particular, but we tend to sort of perpetuate the historical incorrectness, so to speak. And they keep falsifying history and then keep believing in it. The more you say, the more it becomes true, right? So, for example, Columbus landing in America, then calling Native Americans Red Indians. So, in one go, two nationalities, two communities are stereotyped right off the bat, and we don't even think about it. We continue using those terms and those words, and it becomes part of our language. Even when we speak the same sort of language, you don't recognize that we actually are joining in something that we want to actually be critical of. So the history part that you mentioned was absolutely very, very useful from my point of view. And last but not the least comment I'm going to make is you might want to consider looking at New York City regulations and how they have kind of played a significant part in perpetuating segregation.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, thank you for these suggestions. Like, and I'm not saying this as lip service, because as I mentioned before, there's always something new that I even learn and take back from each time I do this workshop. So I think like really making the history more visible, I think that is something that is worth really exploring within like our team, and really talking with, we have a communications team, and during for example, like you have Pride, you have like Pride this month, and there's times where on our social media we share like some bits in history regarding like Pride and the Stonewall riots and how those things manifested, and just really how that movement was started by Black and brown people within the LGBTQI community. So just really being visible, making history visible and accessible to people is definitely something that I consider a very great recommendation, and something that I think our team should be doing more, and something I'll definitely bring back.
And thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and for this presentation, which made that visible and accessible, both of those things. So I thank you again, Ryan and Chris, and I'm going to shift to part 2 of our event tonight, which is a dialogue on community anti-racism efforts. And the reason that we we invited all Manhattan community boards to come and join us for this conversation, and we're very thankful that that half the boards are here, which is wonderful. And we have been limited in our explicit anti-racism work on CB7, and so we wanted to, in thinking of the various things that we could potentially do, we started thinking about ideas and brainstorming, and that's why we have invited all of you here, and the different boards here to share with us the anti-racism, equity, and justice work that you've been doing, the great work that you've been doing. And we can learn from each other, both what's possible and what's necessary. And so we're really excited to hear from everyone. So what I'm going to do is, I've been in communication with sometimes a few people from each board that's attending. What I'm going to do is just call on each board in order. And if you could introduce yourself and your role on your board, that would be great. And then immediately following, so we won't take questions and comments until everybody presents, because we have 5 boards presenting. So each board will present kind of one after the other. And then we will have a question and answer session after that. And we will call on community members, people in the community, to speak first. And I will post a sign-up sheet in the chat where you can sign up to speak. And then immediately following the presentations, we'll call on community members to speak. Please use your legal name in the sign-up sheet. And then after that, we're going to call on board members and people from any board that are here with us. I first just wanted to ask if I want to say welcome to Stephen, our board chair, who's joined us. And also Shelley Fine is here. And so I wanted to ask if Stephen or Shelley wanted to say anything before we start the presentations.
I mean, I'll be very brief. That I'm here to sort of observe and learn and take this all in. And once again, you guys have done a wonderful job putting together a great content, great speakers, and I'm excited to continue to listen to hear the second half. Thank you for putting this together.
Okay, and I'm so fortunate to have a wonderful co-chair who's put so much effort and work in making this happen together with Rosa, and did something extraordinary, which I think we should do more often. I spent 3 months in an anti-racist group discussion once a week, and so I've learned a lot. But here we have people from 6 community boards and who've done work. And the idea of just saying, we're going to do the work and not learn from others. And we're going to create something, you know, that we think is important without having the benefit of other people's experience in trying to do just that. So more collaboration between community boards on many issues would be very, very valuable. And I thank Catherine in particular for all the effort to put together with our board staff, Michelle in particular, and others, and April Adams from the Borough President's Office for making connections with some of those boards, and those boards for being so responsive so quickly to share. And we thank you and appreciate what's coming up. So thank you all very much. I just want to say I had surgery a week ago. So somehow I'm sitting here, you know, taking it all in, but the spirit of the work has lifted me. So sometimes when you're emotionally uplifted, the pain is in a whole different level. So I will try to stay here visually the whole night. If it gets bad, I will listen and disappear a little bit. So please excuse me. Okay.
Thank you, Shelley, and we're glad that you're here with us, and thank you for those comments. So we're going to hear from Community Board 1 first. Anyone is here from Community Board 1? Okay, we'll try again later to see if anyone joins us from Community Board 1. And for now, we'll move to Community Board 2.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I'm Mar Fitzgerald. I am the co-chair of the Equity Working Group, which is the social justice arm of Community Board 2. My co-chair, Patricia Laria, is there, and our board chair, Janine Kiley, is also here, along with Betty Kabovi-Weiss, who is an EWG member, and Brian Pape, who is a board member. So, as I said, the Equity Working Group is the social justice arm of CB2. We formed a year ago on Juneteenth, so we're just after our anniversary. You know, in response to, well, the murders of Black men across the country, and the consequent protests and feeling of unrest. And we wanted to address that in our neighborhoods. So let's see, what did I say? Sorry, 1 second. So in the last year, we've been lucky enough to support our local Black businesses. We have been able to advocate for the desegregation of our public schools, for our kids to have the benefit of culturally responsive curriculum combined with the diverse teacher workforce, so that their history is taught by individuals with lived experience from an informed perspective. We also work very passionately on land acknowledgement. And what that is acknowledgement and monumentalization of the significant historical sites for African Americans and others in our neighborhoods. There are many. We started with the 130 acres that were granted in 1643 by the Dutch to freed Blacks. There are 28 or 29 sites, 25 of them actually are in CB2. So we had a presentation for that, and that was great. That was not in the presentation we just saw, right? We noticed that the history always starts after the British come. What we don't know is that, you know, we were here way before that. And in fact, you know, Black people owned Chinatown, Black people owned Washington Square Park. So we are really, really trying to uplift that history. And, you know, not just because it's good to know, but because particularly in this climate, in this country, I feel like Black people specifically need pride of place. And if we learn that we were here, that these were our lands, you know, of course it is the land of the Lenapes, right? But that once we had place here, we grew here, we raised our families, we worshiped here, you know, it gives ownership and it helps belonging in a time when so often we're told we don't belong. We've also been doing a lot of work in Chinatown, of course, in response to the pandemic and the unique effects of the pandemic on that community. And the blessing, well, not the blessing, but the result of that is that we've really been able to engage with Chinatown's residents and leaders, which perhaps wasn't happening so much before with our board, even though that's, you know, a huge part of our board. And so to really connect with them has been a blessing for us. And that's something we plan to continue to do to uplift, you know, the concerns of the people of that community and make sure that they are addressed. Some of the things that we've done, well, in our first meeting, we went over norms, high frequency terms, just to get everybody kind of up to speed. Then we talked to our board about, you know, what do you think this is? What do you want to see? And we realized that it would be important to examine our board operations through an equity lens, because we weren't doing that. And when Patricia and I went out trying to find these Black businesses and these sites, what we realized was that, you know, these communities aren't coming to the board. They don't, it was almost like, well, that's not for us, that's for them. And so, you know, we wanted to look at our operations like SLA, for instance. You know, it didn't dawn on anybody that maybe establishments were using dress codes to discriminate, right? And so now we ask the question, you know, are you using dress codes? So we can determine, you know, what is the motivation? Is that really necessary? What about your staffing? Is there diversity there? Are you looking to the immediate community? You know, we ask all of these questions now, and you know, it becomes muscle memory when you ask these questions, right? Because, you know, it does. You start asking and it changes your thinking. It changes the way you look at things. And that really is one of our goals, right? To change the status quo and the way we think about things, to address injustice and to move closer to inclusiveness. And I will also say that we were very, very lucky because our immediate past chair, Carter Booth, and our current chair, Jean Kiley, really understood the importance of this work and really understood it was important to have two Black women lead this work, two Black women who were already doing this work in other facets of their lives, to make it happen, that it wasn't going to work, you know, any other way. And also, you know, the diversity on our board was another thing that we really wanted to examine. And we are getting more diverse by the day. So that's great. And I could go on and on and on, but I will pass it off to the next board.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? I can't see the sign that's telling me if I'm muted or not. Okay, everybody can hear me. That was so full of, there was so much in that. I just want to learn more. So there was so much there to unpack. And I'm taking notes along with Robert, who's taking minutes, and I'm excited to follow up with both of you, with all of you who are here. I know there's several people here. So now we turn to Community Board 4.
Hey, Katie, you go first.
Sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Katie Stokes, and Viren and I are the co-chairs. And it's interesting to hear from Community Board 2. It sounds like we have followed a very similar trajectory, because we too formed our group in June of 2020 in response to the murders of several, including George Floyd. But the way we formed, our chair invited all of our board members. He said, look, just send me an email if you'd like to join this group. But then he said what he was looking for was for the group to form, and we actually met weekly for 7 weeks on Zoom, of course. It was in the height of the pandemic. But, and the goal was for this loose group was for us to all share and discuss and brainstorm what we wanted to address and what recommendations we wanted to make to our full board meeting, which was at the end of July. And so there was a lot of discussion and a lot of work. So it was very intense for those first 7 weeks. And then we had some presentations, or a presentation with recommendations at the end of July. And as you can imagine, you know, and we encourage people, like, throw out anything. Our board, I think like many of you probably, have a real focus on trying to think about, like, there are lots of big issues in the world, but we really have to stay sort of practical and focused on our community and what are practical steps, concrete steps that we can take to address these issues. And what are the issues that we want to be able to address in connection with racial and social justice, racial inequities and social justice. And by the way, as you can imagine, one of the issues that came up, because lots of people emailed our board chair to say that they wanted to be on it, but it also sort of went to, like, okay, who's going to co-chair it? And as you can all see, you know, I'm a very white woman. And so there were also questions about, should there be a white woman as a co-chair? And our board chair decided, well, for a variety of reasons, but, you know, we talked about the fact that it's really important that white people are doing the work too. And that we weren't sort of saying, we'll just sort of sit back and let others take the lead. So I think that was a controversial choice, but it was also really important to me to make sure that everybody felt included, and that I wasn't shutting up other voices. And obviously it was great that we set it up, and it sounds like CB2 did too, that we have co-chairs. So anyway, that was certainly one interesting issue that came up. But one of the big recommendations we made, by the way, was that we encouraged our board at every board meeting to hear to invite one of the representatives. We actually have 4 police precincts in our district. And so every board meeting starts with the head of one of the police precincts giving us a report. Because one of the big topics that came up for our task force was to address police accountability issues. But we also, it was very important to us to address our own internal board setup and issues. So it sounds like that was very similar to what you guys were looking at. So one of the things we decided to do, because of course more people were being invited to join the board this year, is that we wanted to do outreach and make sure that we were all encouraging, especially people of color, to apply to our board. And not just as full board members, because we realized that actually takes some privilege in and of itself to have the time and the ability to commit to that. But we also wanted to encourage, you know, more people of color to join certain committees. You know, you don't have to be a full board member, but so that was also an important piece to us. But I'll turn it over to Viren to help sort of address the main topics that we've addressed this year. So over to you, Viren.
No, I think you covered most of the stuff, but I think one of the kind of fundamental questions, I mean, this is CB4, right? It's Hell's Kitchen in Chelsea. And it's a pretty large district. It's a gateway to Manhattan from the west side. You know, you've got tunnels coming in, you've got ferries coming in, you've got helicopters coming in. So you name it, right? You got everything that you can ask for. So one of the first questions that Katie and I kind of confronted was define community, define the community district itself. Is it the community board that belongs to only the people who live here? What about people who come to work in the district? What about kids who come to study in the public high schools and non-public high schools as well? What about shelters we have? What about the hotels we have? People actually spend quite a bit of time in here. So understanding that definition was a kind of struggle because, as you know, as a community board yourselves, the community districts are very narrowly defined. And we had to sort of grapple with that understanding internally, that it's not just us and them, it's us and us. And that was a kind of little bit of a challenge, right? The second thing that you always, I'm sure you confronted that as well. Do we really have racism in our district? I mean, that's the first question people would ask you. And, you know, obvious answer is, not that I know. But that is where the sort of subtleties come into play. And then you start reading between the lines and you begin to kind of observe by listening to each other as to what their experiences tell you and whatnot. So that was the other thing that we kind of tried to do. So the first 7 weeks were all listening sessions. And we asked those questions to each other. Do you really feel that we really need to respond to this in a particular way or in a more generic kind of fashion? To stand in solidarity with a community and a racial group is one thing, but to begin to kind of not simply empathize, but become part of that movement to bring about change, you need to begin to define your own understanding of it. So that is where we also kind of put a little bit of emphasis. The other emphasis that we put on the other sort of focus that we kind of developed was to look internally, look at the bylaws of CB4, understand what we are doing right and what we are not doing right. So one part of what Katie talked about is become more inclusive, invite more, do an outreach so people who do not know that they can actually become part of the community board are welcomed. Beyond that, even understanding how the committees are structured, it's an ongoing process. It's not done yet, and we are still looking into that. So I think this last year has been more about learning experience, more than sort of coming out with resolutions that actually are going to make the change overnight. And that's where we are. And some of the other sort of more subtle changes that we're looking to understand, we don't have exact sort of solutions for those, is our role is to understand zoning, land use, and bylaws of the city that governs itself in a particular way. What about implicit sort of flaws in that system itself? So we can complain about housing discrimination, we can complain about lack of affordable housing in our district, but when it comes to looking at affordable housing in CB4, AMI being 80% of median income, being much higher precludes other folks from coming in. We haven't begun to sort of understand and grapple with those scenarios. So from my personal point of view and sort of the group's point of view, we are kind of expanding the social and racial disparities to include cultural sort of disparities, cultural justice, so to speak, and spatial kind of justice, where our streets and our public space and how they are not totally inclusive and whatnot. So I want to stop right there, but there's a whole lot of work that I think focus more internally than trying to change the whole world in one go.
Yeah, and one thing I would just add to that, I think, Baron, you covered so much, but just about structure stuff for our community board, and I suspect maybe the rest of you are facing a similar issue. A lot of issues that we've identified as wanting to address fall very much squarely amongst some of our committees as well. And so we've also sort of talked about, like, how do we manage between us? How do we collaborate between a committee and our task force, for example? So one of the issues that was mentioned in the earlier presentation was very much something that we identified, which was the whole idea of, the health disparities, especially when it comes to, COVID and the vaccines. But obviously there's a whole issue, as was identified earlier, about maternal morbidity rates are much, much higher amongst Black women than others. So anyway, but that's obviously an issue that also falls very much within the purview of our Housing, Health, and Human Services Committee. So we actually hosted a forum, both our committee and our task force together hosted a forum on health disparities. So that was something that we did jointly. And we sort of talked, about all the issues we wanted to make sure were addressed, and then invited people to come speak to it. And we got such great information. So anyway, so we think that that's also important for each of our community boards to deal with, right? Is to think about the equity work, but also collaborating with our committees and working together in order to improve things. Thanks.
And one last quick point I'm going to make it. Chelsea and House Kitchen both have public housing, and we have a pretty large NYCHA communities and community, and we also have public schools in the neighborhood. So the youth employment, engaging the NYCHA community in the sort of conversations, much larger conversations about how this district sort of looks at both zoning, land use, and sort of other issues in terms of creating opportunities. We did a few sessions about youth employment, outreach to NYCHA community, and it's also a major arts community in the neighborhood. So they're connecting these different organizations to come together to create that sense of inclusivity, rather than simply take it upon ourselves and say, okay, we can do this and that, and we can start changing stuff. But engaging those organizations was one of the sort of major thrusts of our initial effort. I mean, it's an ongoing effort, I would say. You're on mute.
Okay, am I unmuted now? Everybody can hear? Okay, the live transcription is actually covering where I can see whether I'm muted or not. Thank you so much. There's so many great ideas. Thank you also for making your process visible and kind of the questions that came up and the difficult decisions, and for all of those great ideas. I don't know about everybody else, but my mind is just exploding with questions and thoughts and ideas. I look forward to the Q&A. And now we will move to Community Board 6. Community Board 6 is here. I do not see. Okay, and Community Board 12. Okay, so are there any community boards that I missed? Anyone that I missed? Okay, so I think we can start our question and answer session. And I'm just going to post the sign up sheet in the chat one more time. Or I think it's easy for folks to see it. And Rosa, can you see if anybody has signed up to speak from the public? I'll look as well.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so so maybe we can move. So I encourage everyone who's here, any community members, please sign up if you want to ask anybody questions, or if you have comments. We really want to hear from you. I just posted the sign up sheet again, and I think we can take comments from those who are in the space, from committee members, from board members. I can't see the order of the hands. I see that, Rosa, do you have your hand up?
No, I can see it. I can follow.
Okay. Okay, so you can call on people. Okay.
So right now it's Shelley. Go ahead, Shelley.
Okay, so I just want to give a quick overview of what Community Board 7 did. Okay, we didn't have a separate committee. Basically, with the George Floyd murder, we jumped to having I think it was unanimous resolution condemning what had happened and making recommendations for what needed to be. And it was heavy, but it was totally in the feeling of everyone on the board that we needed to do something, and we did. But we also had 1 month on the rise in anti-Semitism with 13 incidents in 10 days, the anti-Asian hate, the disparities in health services in general, and specifically around COVID, and disparities of the testing and the actual incidents of COVID, and the implications that became very clear to us before the city was addressing it, that this was not a new problem. This was an old problem, the health disparities and other disparities based on race and based upon economics. So we kept doing it. When we discussed our, our district needs, we addressed issues of homelessness and other things, which are unique in one respect, but very often highly populated by people of color and low-income people of color. So we struggled with all these issues the whole year. And specifically, this is like the culmination of a lot, but we didn't deal with it directly. What I loved hearing was that tonight, and a lot of things, was something that we used to have. Okay, we used to have board members, committee members who were not board members. Okay, and if they came to three meetings, okay, then they could be a part of that committee, and we'd even do accounting for their vote. And together with that, whenever I went to for my recertification for the community board, I always asked, did you have any questions? It used to be individual. And I said, well, yeah, do we have any Mexican Americans on our board? Do we have any this? I would go through a list of 15 groups. And I said, don't necessarily have to have one of each, but there's a Haitian population here, and they're not coming to our community board, and they're not applying, I was told. Well, whose responsibility is that? And you could say, okay, it's the borough president, whoever that was at the time over the years, but it was also our responsibility. How are we engaging the community? The communities that didn't come out naturally, okay, in our community board. So it was a combination of populating the community board, possibly a little differently, which was going to be not within our purview, but we could do it, and I think we should do it, by making a conscious effort to bring people in the community from different groups to our committees, and maybe setting up a way that they can have some status. Because to ask people to come and they can't vote, it won't count officially, but it should be recognized, or their contribution is just, I'm coming, giving my time. How about recognizing these people as committee members? And in that way, jumping the gun on our elected officials who are good people, but who haven't populated our community board with certain representatives, certain thinking in certain groups. I think to me, when you said that we had people on our on our committee who were not board members, I said, we can do something about that. The last thing that I'm thinking, I appreciated a lot of the things that were done. I think we need to take some formal action that, that codifies certain practices in terms of outreach and in terms of our committees, if we really mean what we say. Okay, we have to do what we can do, and I'm really so moved by the other community boards and how much direct effort you put in to making something happen at a crucial point and making it explicit, and that I'm sure caused a lot of discomfort. Maybe there was a desire and agreement, but as much as people would like to deal with things, it's not we're doing that again this week. We're doing that again this month. But we have issues that need to be addressed. And if we can't learn to recognize, the other thing was the history. Every time something comes up, we find out there was a group of people who were in this place before the people who we thought were in the place. And when people, I agree with what was said. If you know that your ancestors or people like you were a part of this to begin with, you have more sense of ownership and a right to be there. My grandparents came here. They weren't considered white. Jewish people in the turn of the century up to 2020 1920 weren't white because they were not American, and either were Irish and either were Italians. In the third generation, maybe for people from my family, we have it better, but everybody struggled. But a part of the struggle was not being accepted, okay, and having discrimination. And a lot of it was direct in those days. It was almost a way of life. You can't do this, so you can't be hired, you can't get promoted. And the last thing I'll say was when I was in my last year of high school, I had been working at Merrill Lynch after school for 6 hours from 4 to 10. And I made college, I made City College. And no one there went to college. So I got someone from the 14th floor from the executive offices came down with a brochure about how I could be in the junior executive program. And I got so excited, I went home and showed my parents. And then I looked more carefully. There wasn't a Jewish name. Though, I won't say who was there, but no one was represented who I had associated with. Okay, not only Jewish, but others. And I said, why are they doing this? Okay, because I was working there. Maybe they're looking to take one person. How would I ever rise in this, in this organization? It's set up against it. And maybe they want to have someone on the 5th level with a name to show that they're not discriminating or welcoming. So there's a lot that people have gone through. The only thing that always bothers me about these discussions is the individual. That certain individuals didn't have the experience of their group, okay? And some people feel alienated because of that. I think we have to be sensitive that because of a person's color, religion, ethnic thing, we don't know anything about them necessarily. And I think that's important. We're all individuals. The society has certain issues. Historically, we have issues. Socially, we have issues. Economically, we have issues. But there are individuals who have had different life experiences. I think we should not deny people their right to who they are as an individual and what they experienced. So I said a lot. I appreciate you listening and no one interrupted me, but just some ideas.
We have one person that has signed up from the public.
Orlando, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I am. Hi, how are you?
Yep.
Thank you, everybody, for convening this meeting, especially to all the community boards that are here today. I'm Orlando Valles. I'm the representative for Assemblymember Carmen de la Rosa. I'm her chief of staff, and I have participated in a number of calls with the Human Rights Division. And I also was part of the circles that they did with New York, I think it's called New York Public Institute, if I'm not mistaken. No, New York Peace Institute. So they've talked about a lot of these issues as they're pervasive in our community, especially within our Black and Brown communities and the different historical the historical origins of our immigrant communities and the fact that they actually come from oppressed governments from before. Sorry about that background noise, my daughter. I apologize for it in advance. So the assembly members are adamant about this, having this conversation forward. Abby, hold on. So, and we've been also a part of a call with public advocate Jumani Williams. And throughout, I think it was during the pandemic that we had this call. And we have to identify spaces, not-for-profits, people that are doing the work on the ground that are willing to push this conversation forward about racial identity, about colorism, about racism and anti-Blackness, because we also have to understand that in our communities, we have people that are somewhat literate, if not illiterate, and sometimes they're not as educated as we may be about these issues. They don't see themselves with an identity problem sometimes, so they don't see themselves. They don't identify themselves as Black for a number of reasons. And I'm not saying that's to excuse them or to justify them. I'm just saying that they didn't have those lenses, they didn't have those opportunities to actually talk about race in a holistic manner. So it is important to actually have this kind of conversation, to involve local non-for-profits, to involve government entities, to involve elected officials, and people that do resemble the community and actually look like, Black and brown, and that are doing the work on the ground, that are having different experiences with this particular issue. I recall that there was an issue that happened in Dykeman around whenever people were when they had the George Floyd manifestations and protests, and there was something associated with looting, and there was an incident that happened in Dykeman that it was denounced, and it was brought to the attention of a lot of elected officials, and a lot of the message was kind of misconstrued and misled, but we are familiar about what actually happened there, and the fact that the NYPD was actually somehow deputizing community members to do some of the work in protecting the small businesses was already problematic. And we wanted to make sure that the community is as educated as and that they're actually an integral part of having these conversations that are super important because they affect people, impacts families, impacts Black and brown communities, and it is important to have these kind of initiatives. So I commend you all. I commend the leadership. I commend everybody that and I'm saying this as a person, as a human, not just as somebody that represents an elected official, but the assembly member is glad that we're having this kind of conversations, and she's in a community board meeting right now. She's trying her best to join briefly, but just be aware that she's actually an ally, to having these conversations, and a supporter, and somebody that wants to make sure that these conversations are coming to fruition, are coming to spaces where these conversations are not touched on, are not even mentioned, or whether it's our elder community, our younger people, or people that are in high school, and just people that are part of the community as a overall. So thank you all for having us, and thank you all for inviting our office. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And can you put your contact information in the chat to me so that I can follow up with you? And thank you so much for being here. And for those comments. I have like a ton of questions, but I want to make sure that everybody here has the chance to ask questions before I go.
Kristen is up next. Kristen Berger.
Hi, I raised my hand. I'm Kristen Berger. I'm a new member on CB7. So I hope I'm in the right part of question asking. All right. I wanted to really I was very impressed with the work of the two boards that have developed task forces or committees. I don't know if CB4 was called a committee or a task force, but and I come from a place of naivety because I don't know what CB7's been doing just from what Shelley's briefed us on. But I really love the idea of a task force because it's something where the work is ongoing, right? The work's not done. We can't get to a point where we're like, oh, we had a resolution or we changed one committee. I think it would be nice to have something that's ongoing and it can be an iterative process, learning over time. So I'm just sort of throwing this out there. I guess it's sort of a question or a challenge more to CB7, but I think it's a terrific model that we heard about tonight. I'm really enthused by the idea of something like that.
And if there's a standing committee that was focused on it, can you remind me what the names of the task forces were again? There was the equity, and then there was, if we can, and if you talked about having like a standing committee focused on that, and so it'd be more permanent.
Ours is a task force, so we're the Social and Racial Justice Task Force. Try and write that out a lot of times, and it's sort of exhausting. I actually think that I guess you guys said yours was the Equity Working Group. Much easier to say. Good on you. On CB2, we did talk about, should we be a regular committee? Should we be a task force? Should it be permanent? Should it just, how should it work? But it was actually, as I said, we had this 7 weeks of meeting every week, and we did decide to recommend that it go forward, that it meet monthly. And our executive committee decided, instead of it being a committee, so requiring, other people might have to come off of other committees to be on it, they decided to keep it a task force so people could still be on 2 committees and be on this. That's how we did it. I don't know about CB2.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we called it a task force was because the working group doesn't need to have public meetings, and we wanted to have public meetings. So that was one of the reasons why we actually called it a task force, or became a task force, because we wanted to engage public.
We always have, all of our meetings are public. And we did talk about, what this we do want to keep it, I think, as a board and what it would look like. But we also realized there was a lot of overlap with our reopening working group, particularly in the area of Chinatown and our businesses. And so, when all is said and done, maybe that becomes a committee. Those 2 things become something else. We're not sure, but we also know that as a working group, we still have a lot of work to do. So that's somewhere down the line. Did you want to add to that, Patricia?
No, you summed it up, Mar. Thank you.
Should we go over some of the other questions you asked? Oh, there's a hand.
Hi, I don't know if this is the right time for me to make a comment, but I just wanted to say that it is thought-provoking thinking about all of the committees that we have at CB7 and looking at them through the lens of social and racial justice. And I just started to go through a little exercise in my head, going down the line of each one of our committees and how these issues, might be relevant and are relevant. And I was just thinking about our Business Consumer Issues Committee and, the more women-owned and minority businesses and how can we support them. And then I thought about transportation, and I thought about, not only racial inequity, but also issues with age, people that are able-bodied, they're not able-bodied, people that are able to ride a bicycle or a car that are not able to. And just going down the list, and I just think we can, it's exciting to me because I think we can actually really go through each one of our committees and then perhaps broaden to have either another task force or committee, but I'll yield to Stephen Brown, our chair, about this. But this is very thought-provoking, and my wheels are turning. Thanks.
Thank you. Mar, did you want to add some things? You mentioned like other questions.
Oh, no, there was a lull and you sent us all those questions before and I was like, we could do that. So.
Are there any other hands that are raised? I have like a few questions.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so I really appreciate how specific the work. I think on CB2, like you mentioned, work that was relevant to the different committees, as Doug said. You talked about, I think in the context, if I'm reading my notes correctly, you talked about Black businesses, reaching out to them, thinking about the SLA process and asking questions about dress code. You talked about focusing on integration, I think in education and the curriculum and history and all of these like really specific kind of places on the board, like areas. On CB7, the committees are very autonomous. And and the leaders of the committees are often primarily setting the agendas. And there's not necessarily collaboration among committees or dialogue about what those committees will focus on. So was there a process? And then someone also mentioned listening sessions, which was so fantastic, where you just initially just started talking about what this meant and why it mattered. And developing understanding. And so was there a process of kind of creating some consensus about this being a value and important and about kind of all that? I think there was also a mentioning of having the police come to meetings so that to ask some questions around accountability of what they're doing. So it sounds like this is happening on lots of layers in lots of areas in your board. Was there a process of kind of coming together, coming to consensus, prioritizing as a board, or was there some struggle involved in prioritizing racial equity and justice? And how did that process work?
Well, I mean, we began with a letter. It all started with a letter about the murders of Black men and why it was important that we do something about it. And we presented it at full board. I mean, at our full board meeting and voted on it. So that here, these are all of our docs and that letter's in there if anybody wants to read it. But that was really a way to gather the entire board around this important work. And, you know, it passed unanimously, the letter, uplifting, you know, it was our commitment. It was a commitment, actually, that all 50 board members signed, a commitment to social justice. And so that's where we started, right? And then I think it was our second meeting. Our first meeting was, you know, what does the committee want to do? And the working group want to do? What did they see? What are the goals? What are their thoughts? And then our second meeting really was, I think, the operations. And we met with every single committee and had them come in and we gave them a chart, a survey. Have you thought about this? Do you ask this? Who comes to you? How do you find people? What about your operation? You know, we asked all the right questions and we really engaged the rest of the board, you know, specific to their committees. So that was great. And yes, there was some apprehension, like, why are you looking into our operations? This is not your committee. But when we got to talking to people, they were like, oh, yes, well, that's an equity issue. And I am a part of this conversation. And it was really empowering. And so that was great. That's how we got buy-in from the rest of the board. Yeah, what was the second part of the question?
No, I think that was a very full and complete answer. So thank you so much for that. Does anybody else want to kind of respond to that? I don't know if CB4 does.
I was going to say, Mar, I love the fact that you guys sort of did a survey out to each of your committees and then met with them. That's awesome. As I mentioned, we had a slightly different approach. Basically, we said anybody who wanted to join initially we were a working group, but that we were going to meet every single week for 7 weeks. And so whoever joined that group, and it was a bunch of folks, and then we said, toss out ideas and let's whiteboard everything. And at the end of that, we had about 15 recommendations that then were voted on by the full board. And then we were officially made into a task force and had public meetings. And then we've met every week or every month since then. And as I said, when we've seen issues that have come up, we've then reached out to some of the committee heads and said, oh, we were thinking about this. And, as I said, we did this joint health disparities forum and that sort of thing. But I love the idea of actually meeting with the heads of every single committee. I will say, you asked if there were some issues. It was pretty clear in the beginning, I have to say, that while there was, certainly lots of support for our board addressing these issues, there was also some trepidation. And I think there were some people on our board who were concerned that we were sort of, if we were authorized as like an official group, that we might sort of become like, they called us like the thought police, or, that we might be sort of the scolding team, and that we would be out there to sort of scold everybody for how they were doing things. And so we had to,
Katie, you're freezing. Katie, can you hear us? You're freezing. Just like Katie, I'm just going to sort of pick up on what she was talking about. Yes, we were very conscious of not playing the police for the community board. We didn't want to give the impression that we're actually checking on each committee's work and questioning it necessarily. But the good news that we had was that we had members from practically every committee on the board who joined the task force. So that became a kind of vehicle to engage with the committee conversations. There she's back. That was one way we kind of tried to bridge the gap in terms of understanding what the committee's conversations were and how we could try and straddle some of the themes. So for example, Transportation Committee might have an issue, and I happen to be on Transportation Committee, and if it has an issue about equity, I bring it up, or somebody else brings it up. If it still can remain in the committee, but can address the issue of equity, then it stays there. But we always offer that if they want to bring it as a kind of a joint conversation, we are very happy to take it on. And by and large, things have happened quite well. So for example, what Katie was talking about, the health disparities forum took place in tandem with the Housing and Human Services Committee. Youth employment, we actually joined up with the AES committee, Arts and Education Committee. And similarly, we're trying to find ways in which we can actually create more connections within the CD4 committees to move forward. And I'm not giving you the whole list of it, but that's how sort of it's been structured. Katie, you're back.
Yeah, even 16 months later, I'm still having Zoom problems. What can I say? Sounds like you covered it though, Viren.
Yeah, we did the same thing. We've traffic and transportation joint meetings, social services joint meetings, schools and ed joint meetings, reopening working group joint meetings, because, there's just so much overlap. So yeah, we did the same thing.
Yeah. So Marv, what you did is even better because, we didn't actually have meetings with each committee. And I think what you did sounds even much more effective, so to speak, to actually do that kind of an outreach and see where can we actually connect, where can we explore themes that actually can be explored jointly. And we didn't I mean, personally, if I can speak about that, we didn't feel the need to do that because we had practically members from each of the committees as part of the task force.
That's great. We also, by the way, we hit the pavement, right? I don't know if you guys know about the demographics of CB2, but it's hard to find people of color. And we actually went around all of our neighborhoods just to see what was going on and engaged with the public to bring them in. We went personally and, put up posters and handed out flyers if we were having meetings in Chinatown, and we made sure they were translated into, simplified and traditional Chinese. So, and we asked over and over and over again for every meeting for a translator. We never got one. And that's another thing, language access. It's a huge equity issue. But yeah, we put our whole bodies into it every time.
Our whole bodies every time. So I think and because it's 8:45 and we've been going since 6, I want to put out a last call for any questions or comments. Anybody has anything else? And I will definitely follow up with everybody who came, because there's too much wisdom and great ideas that I really want to follow up on. So I will follow up with everyone, including Kristen, our new member. I'm so glad you came to our meeting. So I will also follow up with you. Any other final comments before, and then we'll close this, and then we have an agenda item for HHS. So HHS will stay on for one last piece of HHS business.
Actually, I'll just make one very small extra comment that might sound sort of silly, but we realized that we had a lovely opportunity. And that is that we realized, like, in February, it was Black History Month, and then in March it was Women's History Month. And we decided, let's take the opportunity to do some, research in our own district, and let's find somebody or a couple of people whose stories we can celebrate, right? And so in February, it was awesome. We were able to tell some stories and celebrate some Black members who had lived in our district. And then we did the same thing for Women's History Month in March. And then we were talking about doing the same thing in June. And we actually didn't get ourselves quite organized for that one for Pride. But I just think it's a great thing that you realize, like, there's so much great stuff and people and stories that we can celebrate in our districts, and to really highlight some of the amazing diversity, that's just a lovely thing to do too, right? Is to just get some of our stories out there. So
that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. I have a cold and I have a cough. But thank
so
you.
while she's coughing, we're going to give her a big thank you.
Yeah.
And I want to thank Rosa Arenas, who this wouldn't have happened for her if it weren't for her, because she took the initiative, and we've been talking about this for months. And so I want to thank Rosa, and Rosa also is our Zoom host. So thank you so much, Rosa. And I'm so glad that we did this. I learned so much, and I look forward to following up with everyone. So on that note, we are going to, on HHS, I think I just have, so goodbye everybody. I'll definitely follow up with you. So until next time. So on HHS, we are going to, in the next week or two, we will send out a draft of the district needs statement and budget priorities we've identified to get your feedback. So if you have any thoughts or ideas about that, please let Shelley and me know. And if you have if you want to talk about it or have ideas for it right now, you can reach out to us. And if you have any questions, let us know. That's the only piece that I have. Shelley, is there anything else that you have?
Just an announcement that next month, in addition to working on district needs statement budget priorities, we'll have a presentation on a proposed new affordable housing situation on 107th Street in our district. It's not totally formulated, but we will have the agency that's going to be involved with it. We've encouraged them to first speak to the people on the block in the neighborhood who are the institutions, the individuals, the tenants associations, block associations, so that the people don't find out things about their neighborhood at the community board for the first time. And we said, please do this. We're not going to try to cut short your involvement with elected officials, but speak to the people who are going to be impacted most. Work out issues with them if they have issues. Let them be a part of the process. And so that's what they're doing. They were going to possibly make an announcement today, but it's not totally formulated yet. So it would be like spreading a rumor, and that wouldn't be helpful. So we have something good to look forward to. Affordable permanent housing in our neighborhood.
Great, thank you. Are there any other comments, questions, thoughts? I want to
just to thank you.
Well, thank you, Madge, for being here. Thanks to everyone for being here. And I especially want to thank folks on the board who aren't a part of our committee. This makes it your, third or fourth meeting of the month. So we're really glad that you were able to be with us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen, for supporting this work. We really appreciate your being here too. And Kristen, I'm excited that you're here and to follow up with you. So I will do that. Before we right when we adjourn, Rosa, before we leave the meeting, I just want to go through the chat and grab a couple things before you close out of the meeting. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right.
Bye.
Okay. Bye, everybody. And Rosa, give me 2 seconds to get to just capture the chat. Are you still, you're still there, Rosa? You are, okay. Okay. There's actually like a ton of comments. Is that preserved, do you think, in the account?
I saved the chat.
You saved the chat?
Yeah.
So this should all be there, right?
Mm-hmm.
The chat, the comments to panelists and to attendees?
You can save it too. If you go to you see the 3 dots next to file where it says to in the chat, if you have the chat open.
I do, but okay, you're amazing for helping me with this. Okay, so the 3 dots, save chat.
Click on that and save chat.
Wow. Okay, so now it's saved in my computer?
Yep.
Okay, so hold on 1 second. All right, now it's just us. So, how do we?
We're still live on. We're still live on YouTube.
Oh, we are.
So
Okay.
Yeah, we should get off.
So I will follow up with both of you, and
Sure.
and I think that went great.